The county I practice in has one of the highest rates of personal belief objections to vaccines in the country. Most states don't permit it. California does. When we first started having a pertussis outbreak, we assumed that this would be primarily in our unvaccinated population, and actually started this study to look at those issues. And what we pretty quickly identified is that the bulk of the outbreak was in vaccinated, fully vaccinated, up-to-date children. And in addition, it was really collected in the 8 to 12 year age group. Older kids and younger kids seemed to be pretty well protected, but the 8 to 12 was the vast, vast bulk of our cases. And when we examined that, it really correlated to being more than 3 years from your last vaccine booster dose.
All right. So why don't you, maybe you could, it would help to get a sense of how many numbers of children are involved, and whether there, say, if one child in a family becomes ill with whooping cough, does this transfer to siblings or to other family members, parents, neighbors, you name it? But I mean, what's the overall impact that we're looking at?
The people we looked at, we actually had a practice agreement that these would be only children that had severe prolonged cough would even be screened. The impact, the greatest fear of the impact is transmission to infants, because virtually by definition, those under 6 months of age can't be fully vaccinated. They don't get their first vaccine until 2 months, and even though they have some protection, they really don't have full protection from the vaccine series until 6 months of age. So when we look at deaths from pertussis, this is the group most at risk. When we look at families, obviously families are the ones at risk of transmitting this to the infants. Parents, grandparents, and obviously older siblings. So one of the focuses of our study is these young pre-adolescents are obviously the at-risk group to transmit it to their younger siblings. The other impact is, if you will, herd immunity. When this spreads very rapidly through our middle schools, we actually had a fairly high absenteeism rate during this period, and a lot of these children presumably had pertussis. They didn't seek care. They weren't diagnosed. Certainly, a lot of the cases were mitigated by vaccine. We know that the vaccine mitigates the severity of the disease. So having a mild case of pertussis is not much problem for the child that has it, but maybe a deadly problem for the younger sibling. And then once again, we also worry about our unvaccinated population in our county.
Can you give us any numbers to give us a sense of how deeply into the population this is penetrating?
So we, Kaiser Permanente in the West Coast is we insure about 40% of the persons in Marin County. So it's a high penetrance. We have an electronic record and collect all visits, all data, all labs. So we actually have a pretty good sense of the community in our database. So in that group, there's about 15,000 children in the cohort that we studied. We had confirmed cases, I believe it was 171 at all age groups, and it was 103 at age 12 or less. The attack rate is the highest in California in 50 plus years. So this is really a widespread pertussis outbreak.
And is it confined to your area, your county, or do you have some sense of whether this is a statewide phenomenon?
Yeah, we know that it started, actually, one of the things that piqued our interest is just happenstance, Dr. Katz, the co-author, is a pediatrician who took care of the first case. And this is a family from we both happen to know them. I took care of the mother for a complication of alternative therapy. And they're unvaccinated, the whole family was unvaccinated. And that's what started our interest. But it spread from there very rapidly through the county. Sacramento County spread very rapidly and is statewide and indeed nationwide. Although the really epicenter was in Sacramento and Marin counties, California.
And when you say so this is beginning with families whose children are not being vaccinated, but it's spreading into the general population.
It's certainly the risk. You have to wonder if we suspected pertussis more in an unvaccinated child, where there are other children that we wouldn't have pursued the diagnosis. So it's hard to know that exactly. We found that there still was a higher risk of illness in the unvaccinated compared to the vaccinated, even though that wasn't the focus of this study. We did find a significantly increased rate of clinical pertussis in our unvaccinated children in Marin County. But they're obviously part of the herd immunity. So any group that is unprotected really multiplies the risk to those that are protected.
And maybe, I think it might be helpful if you gave us a sense of how sick some of these children are, because there isn't much current experience with pertussis. It's a pretty serious disease, right?
Right. In California, there were 11 deaths of infants, all in infants, all in young infants who could not have finished their vaccine series. So as far as seriousness, I think anything else that killed 11 infants would be a national crisis. We had no hospitalizations among our cohort. They were older children. That's not that unusual. I think the main consequence is school absenteeism, pneumonia, prolonged convalescence. Actually, one of my adult HIV patients was one of our index patients, and he had repeated cough syncope. He would pass out from coughing repeatedly. He went on about 8 weeks of severe coughing. So the morbidity can be quite severe, even in adults, but it's the infants that the mortality occurs in.
And does this lead to higher use of antibiotics? And I'm trying to get a picture of the overall impact of having a few children drop out of the vaccination program. What are the greater consequences, the broader consequences?
I take great pride in trying to really direct the antibiotics at my medical center in a wise way, and the answer is absolutely. And starting in May of 2010, we had a huge spike in azithromycin, and very clearly it's related to pertussis, fear of pertussis, families getting prophylaxis, getting treatment to prevent disease. We had about a 30% increase in the antibiotic use at that time. We didn't see a measurable bump of others, but that may have been obscured by the large background numbers.
Now, you're not telling me that the families who don't have, who hold their kids back from being vaccinated are using antibiotics prophylactically. That's not going on, is it? This would be, I hope, that seems like a really odd solution to dropping out conscientious objection to vaccines, but please explain what's going on here.
I think the politics of vaccine refusal are really complicated and don't follow a true logic train much of the time. But the answer is, in order to get back to school, they had to take azithromycin. So there was a very strong incentive to take the antibiotics.
So some of the kids who weren't vaccinated got sick and then took antibiotics, and their siblings maybe took it prophylactically?
Right. And
that's a very fascinating outcome.
And the question of, for instance, in the index family, they are fully vaccinated now. It really, and it's a mixed blessing. I think these outbreaks get attention to something that, in the modern U.S., we can pretend that these illnesses don't exist, and I think that the attention delivered by an outbreak, the attention delivered by pandemic flu, has been the best thing we've had for public vaccination.
Yes, the secondary blessings of a new flu is, but let's not go there. I am curious about I guess the relative morbidity, for lack of a better term. The children who, I mean, what are you seeing any kind of pattern for children who have not been vaccinated versus those who were vaccinated but then received, then became sick with a bordetella pertussis infection?
Our numbers didn't have the power to discriminate that. We had an 8% truly unvaccinated rate, which really puts the case number down roughly 9 cases in unvaccinated children. The undervaccinated children were probably not vaccine denialists, but late, tardy parents. And so between those two groups, we didn't have the power to determine clinical illness. Since there were no hospitalizations, there were no clear hallmarks that we could pull out that were a distinction between those two groups.
I get, one thing that I'm wondering about, couched in that question I just put to you, is whether there is vaccine failure, or there's something, maybe the strategy for when vaccine boosters should be administered needs to be tinkered with to improve protection, or is there something bad? It's a vaccine that's been in use for decades, but maybe it needs improvement to give a longer lasting effect or something in these sorts of situations.
Yeah, I think there's several thoughts. Assuming that our data can be generalized, it provides really quite good protection within the first 2 to 3 years. So I think the very young children are well protected. I think the preschool dose of vaccine protects really rather well until 8 years of age. The booster at 12, again, the rate plummeted in our 13-year-olds. I think the booster dose, again, is very effective. So yes, I think there's different strategies that could be used. One would be earlier vaccination with the same vaccine. Another might be targeted response to an outbreak, so that rather than revising a whole vaccine schedule that really would be a mammoth project, and we actually did do this during the outbreak, we gave the 12-year vaccine as early as age 8 to try and blunt the response. The outbreak abated in California. Outbreaks abate either way. We're not sure how much of an impact. Clearly, we had lots of vaccination because none of the 9-year-olds were previously vaccinated. It was not approved below age 10. But that may be actually a very agile strategy for something that is not an annual event, hopefully.
And there was another thought I had. I seem to remember from a few years ago that there was some rise in level of pertussis among late adolescents or even young adults, and maybe in full adults. What I want to get at is whether there was any spillover, whether you see any, you explicitly mentioned 8 to 12-year-olds, but what about other age groups?
Yeah, we know that there's ongoing outbreaks among adults. Studies coming at it a different way, looking at prolonged cough, have identified pertussis as a frequent cause of the cough greater than 3 weeks duration. So we know it's out there. We know that's a reservoir, and the recommendation for adult vaccination is hoping to address that. Again, the dynamics of herd immunity in that case. We still have a large herd that's unimmune in the adults that put the younger ones at risk. Down the line, I think we don't know the status of booster vaccinations beyond 5 years for the adult pertussis vaccine. I certainly hope that gets validated and to decrease the entire unimmune herd.
So what you're getting at, I think I heard you right, that we have a large herd. It's a very strange way to talk about the human population, but a large herd of the unimmune. So we really, the way pertussis vaccination, the strategy behind pertussis vaccination is that we're going to protect children through mid to late adolescence into early adulthood, and then everybody, maybe everybody beyond that stage has waning immunity, and it's up to the next generation of kids to be protected, to protect the adults. Is that what's going on?
You know, I think there's two parts. I think we're a bit captive by the traditional wholesale vaccine, which had significant side effects, and the risk-benefit to vaccinate beyond the preschool dose would really be questionable. I think with the acellular vaccine, which has a very low side effect profile, that changes that dynamic. And I think that is being examined. Right now, there is consideration for booster vaccination for adults. You know, I think that, so the answer is I don't think it rests just with the coming generation to do it. I think we've already implemented certain target strategies. Vaccinating those picking up children, newborns from labor and delivery, is a really high yield strategy. How do you get the caretakers for infants vaccinated? You do it when they pick the child up. So I know hospitals in California, we've implemented at our hospitals, and I know most hospitals are at least trying to get the grandparents doing outreach, particularly during the outbreak, I think is very critical.
Did you see much evidence of many cases among the elderly, among the grandparent generation?
You know, trying to disseminate the word to screen for pertussis among, you know, I'm an internist, Paul is a pediatrician. It's difficult. You know, that we don't think pertussis, we don't think to screen for pertussis. I think adults aren't, you know, internal medicine is not sensitized to actually address this case and realize the implication for the pediatric population. So we tried, we looked at our screening rates, and despite fairly widespread visits for bronchitis, so if we look at our diagnoses, we had a marked uptick in cough, bronchitis, and diagnoses that were compatible with pertussis.
And coincident with this outbreak.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And yet the testing rate was increased because previously it had virtually never been done. We only had about 40 cases in our adult population with actually a fairly low testing rate as its baseline.
I see, all right. And so curiously though, I think for adults, the diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus vaccine, that's reserved for children, but then adults do receive boosters for tetanus, right, periodically, but not for the other two, and diphtheria we know is pretty much gone in the US. There hasn't been a comparable spike, right, tracking with pertussis.
Well, certainly one of the reasons for you know, there was previously some disparity between the ACIP and the American College of Physicians recommendations for tetanus boosting based on tetanus risk. We really don't need every 10-year or 5-year at-risk vaccinations, but it was developed in part after, partly, there's several things that developed at a breakdown in public health when the Soviet Union dismantled, showing that diphtheria could very rapidly return to a vaccinated population. So the every 10-year vaccination recommendation for tetanus is with concomitant diphtheria vaccination in it.
Okay.
I don't even believe that pure tetanus vaccination is available any longer.
Oh, I wasn't aware. I didn't realize when I got my tetanus booster that I was getting the diphtheria shot. Nobody, well, at least my doctor didn't tell me. And I don't mind, but
Right.
I might, who knows, I might want to go to Russia and visit. We do have a question from the internet, I think.
Actually, we have two questions from our Ustream chat room, and the first one's rather simple, so I'm going to give both questions at once. The first question is, at what age are children most likely to be affected by this recurrence of whooping cough? And the second question is, With the mandatory vaccination for pertussis that has started for school children in California, have we seen a decrease in new cases in these last few months?
So two parts. Our data it really supports that it's the pre-teens that are the most at risk, the 8 to 12, 8 to 13-year age group. And again, that's the group that we believe is between your preschool vaccination, which is a pretty effective requirement in California despite personal belief exemptions, and your 12-year booster. That's and for example, our attack rate was, at the peak of that year, was almost 20-fold that of the very young preschool age group. With the booster vaccines required now for admission to school on September 1st, we really don't have a way of having examined that at this point. The epidemic has waned, although not disappeared. Many school districts were given 30-day waivers to comply, so we don't have full vaccination of the 12-year-olds. And once again, personal belief exemptions are accepted for the 12-year booster dose as well, even during this outbreak.
Roughly what percentage of the population in California invokes this exemption?
Depending on your county, it's between about 3 and 10%.
Oh, it's as high as 10%.
Yeah.
That's remarkable.
And I think if you look at pertussis vaccine efficacy, if you assume that, I mean, just for example, 10% of the population is unprotected, and the vaccine is, let's say, 85% effective, you're really talking about a protection in the population of approximately 75%, 75 to 80%. There's still a very large group of unprotected persons, even though some of them are immunized.
But some of that could be improved by improving the vaccine.
Yes.
Which is I mean, it's got a great reputation as being pretty good penetrance, good effectiveness. I'm sorry, we have another question, one from the room.
Hi, I'm Maren McKenna from Wired.com. Dr. Witt, could you take us through what the vaccine schedule is for pertussis?
Sure.
For all the ages from infancy, and also what duration of protection would you have expected in these children that you are not seeing? So if you are seeing this spike that indicates to you a shorter degree of protection than you expected, where should that bump have been?
So the U.S. vaccination schedule is at 2, 4, and 6 months of age, 18 to 24 months of age 4 to 5, and age 12, with now a recommendation for adults who are in at-risk, teachers, caretakers of children, and in general, any adult who's interested in having that protection. And that's right now only approved as a one-time. The question you're asking is surprisingly indirectly answered. So in the initial vaccine trials, it's really been examined for efficacy, which is in randomized trials in vaccine versus unvaccinated groups. They're followed for evidence of disease. It's an incredibly intensive project to study that large number of persons for that many years. So most of these studies look at the effectiveness in the first couple of years to prove the clinical effectiveness of the vaccine. There's actually no study that I found that went on beyond 22 months of direct surveillance. There's several studies that look retrospectively or via national surveillance that suggest a waning of the vaccine as it gets farther from the dose. And that's actually consistent with natural pertussis infection, which gives us partial immunity that wanes. We can get pertussis more than once in our life. So not a surprise that if you're 10 years out, your attack rate is pretty comparable to never having had it, or maybe possibly never having had the vaccine. But very, very limited data.
We have another question from the room.
Yeah, Dr. Witt, Michael Smith, MedPage Today. I have actually a couple of questions, some of which are very simple. Dates of the outbreak, which I don't know off the top of my head. How do you confirm a pertussis infection? That's probably pretty simple. You said there were 11 deaths. Is that in California or nationwide? And you said there were no hospitalizations in your cohort. I assume none of the deaths were in your county. So maybe you can clear that up. And then the more substantive question was, I'm not really clear on what your sort of process was to conclude that the 8 to 12-year-olds were less protected if they were 3 years out from the booster. I'm not clear how you went about getting that information, or where the odds ratios come from and that sort of thing. So the simple questions and then the more complicated one would be great.
So this is actually my memory test, right?
I've already failed, so it's up to you.
Let's start with the last one first. The basis for the conclusion was we actually have very accurate vaccination records on our whole cohort. We knew the date of their last dose. We knew whether they had the five expected preschool doses. And then we looked at the interval between their last vaccination in those who were fully vaccinated and the onset of disease. And what we found was a very low rate of clinical pertussis until really age 8. And at that point it skyrocketed, with the attack rate peaking between age 10 and 12. That was almost 20 times that of the younger children. So very few cases in those that were within 3 years of their vaccination, and then an incredible spike in cases. So it's that time linkage that we've made. You're correct.
Sorry, just to interrupt for
yeah.
a second. What were those attack rates? Can you remember?
I'm sorry?
What were those attack rates? Can you?
The highest attack rate was 3,600 approximately per 100,000 person years, and the lowest attack rates by year of age cohort was 0. But again, just to give you a sense, in the 0 to 5 age group, it was approximately an attack rate of 350 per 100,000 person years versus 10-fold attack rate in the older age group. I'm sorry, age 8 to 12 age group, thank you. Yeah, we had no hospitalizations and no deaths in my cohort, which was our service population of about 140-some thousand persons. The 11 deaths were in California. I don't know the national numbers. This was a national outbreak. Obviously, all the children who died were hospitalized. And I actually don't know the full numbers for California, so I don't know a mortality rate on that either. We identified cases by, again, this was not a randomized prospective trial, but the dates were March 1st is when we looked at our sample, ending October 31st, 2010. In the first week of March, we went to the Department of Pediatrics and developed a practice agreement recognizing that we may have a pertussis outbreak and asking, and pretty good, the department functions as a pretty cohesive unit, asking that any child with prolonged cough illness be screened. And at that point, we were doing it really as the public health sentinel. We have a large bulk of the population. We often serve that purpose. And so that became a fairly effective screening, but we really don't know how many were not screened, and we really don't know how many had minor illness. We have no idea how many didn't seek care.
All right, are you satisfied? I mean, he answered all the questions you wanted. There was something about determining cases, right?
Yeah, how do you actually tell someone has pertussis as opposed to something else?
So we use the prolonged cough illness as our clinical identifier, and used a PCR technique that we do a simultaneous Bordetella pertussis and parapertussis PCR. So our cases include only PCR confirmed pertussis. There is some cross reaction with other Bordetella species that are not they're clinically annoying but not particularly dangerous. the state of California had none of those species isolated during this period. So we believe these were, at least the cases we have were defined pertussis cases. There were probably many more.
All right, we have another question from someone in the room.
Yeah, Ed Sussman, Medical Front Page. Have you, I'm not sure if this is, you've answered this or maybe I just didn't hear the answer. Have you determined if the number of personal belief exemptions has decreased since the outbreak or increased? Have you looked at that at all?
The simple answer is no. The personal belief exemptions have been creeping. I know that in the last 10 years they've been gradually increasing, but that's an interest that would be fairly easy for us to look at. So I know one family that's withdrawn theirs, but I don't know about the others.
Another question.
I have a follow-up question to your response just a moment ago. You were talking about that though prolonged cough illness was your clinical identifier, you name as pertussis cases only those that were PCR confirmed. Given your electronic health records, can you cross-reference those PCR positives with children's vaccine status? In other words, do you know that they were vaccinated children who subsequently developed pertussis?
Right. So of our cases, there was the vast majority were in fully vaccinated, and that was truly the surprise of examining this. They were. So these were fully vaccinated children. It was really quite different than the expected results. Since we have it works out to about a 15% under-vaccinated, counting unvaccinated and those that are not up to date. There was a difference in illness between those groups, between vaccinated children and under-vaccinated children, only in the 13 to 18 age group, and if you use the aggregate of 2 to 18. Interestingly, there was no significant difference in attack rate in the 2 to 7 or 8 to 12 age group, which was surprising. The 13, and I saw your eyebrow raised. The 13 to 18 group, we suspect that there is an under-vaccinated rate because of the 12-year booster, which hasn't been as uniformly implemented. And I suspect there is a protection from the vaccine, even when there's vaccine failure. If you increase the numbers by aggregating our population, all our age groups, we were able to show a statistically significant difference in attack rates.
Oh, thanks. I'm Terry Murray from Medical Post. I'm the deaf one who keeps asking you to repeat things. I'm sorry, I came in a bit late. I may have missed this. And I'm also going to repeat a question that somebody else asked earlier, and that is, if these kids were fully vaccinated and the immunity, not surprisingly, seems to wane after 2.5 or 3 years, would that argue for an earlier than 12-year booster?
I think it might. I think it needs to be confirmed. Our vaccine schedules have been, there's such a large process. It's educating all parents, pediatricians. It needs to be studied to show that, one, that this is validated, and two, that the earlier vaccine would actually impact that. I mean, it's my suspicion it might, but I think before we would change the vaccine schedule, we'd really want to have some better evidence.
And if the immunity wanes and doesn't just go from on to off overnight after 3 years, would you expect any natural boosting from the pertussis in the community?
It's a great question. I would think so. So, people that have had recent pertussis, indeed that's part of the reason the epidemic wanes. People that have had recent pertussis, if we could track them, probably would join our immune cohort. So I think that's very likely.
And then my last question is azithromycin, is there actually antibiotic prophylaxis for pertussis? Or is this just something that people asked for?
No, no, it's very, it's actually required for families, for children, for siblings of cases to get back in school. And that's a very strong incentive when you have daycare or don't.
I have a follow-up question to what Terry just asked. And I'm sorry if you answered this and I just didn't understand you. So aside from this abstract and this press conference, which is obviously important for disseminating the news since we, the media, are here, have you undertaken communication with public health authorities about this finding, about the possibility that you have an underprotected cohort? Since, as you say, there's such a large unvaccinated population, maybe uniquely in California, but certainly across the country, as I can say, having been an adult pertussis patient myself, I would think this would be something of high public health interest.
So the answer is yes. We've communicated with the California Department of Public Health. I know that the Centers for Disease Control is actually looking at, at the pertussis outbreak in many ways, because this was a huge one. And I know they've examined our patient database as well for, various issues from vaccine lots to, to duration and that sort of thing. So the public health authorities are aware of it. I have not seen publications yet to this or abstracts.
I think we have another question from the internet. Jim?
Yes, actually we do. We have two questions from the internet. First is, how long do you believe the initial childhood series lasted or was protective? I'm not quite sure if I think we may have discussed that already. And also, do you think your finding was a significant contributor to the size of last year's outbreak in California? I think they're referring to the waning of the protection in the booster.
So children are well protected, it looks, through age 7. And there's a fairly intensive vaccination schedule in the most at-risk children. I believe so. It'd be interesting to look at California's data as a whole, but it certainly would make sense that that Marin County is not a unique example in this outbreak. The outbreak was extensive and statewide.
And Jim, we have a question up front, if you'd bring the mic.
Actually, I've noticed we have one more question from the chat room, and that is, I know that here in California, so obviously our question asker is from California, public health has pushed vaccination and awareness. The question is, are other states doing the same or similar things to prevent pertussis outbreaks?
Yes. Yeah, this is probably every state has been impacted by last year's outbreak, so this is a broad public health issue.
Now, who had the question?
Just on a follow-up, something you mentioned, has there been any indication that there's any problem with the vaccine lots?
Not that I'm aware of, but I would not know that. I did not examine lots in our...
Yeah, as you said, that's one of the things they're looking at, but there's no indication that there's a problem with the vaccine itself.
Oh, there's certainly no indication now, right?
All right, we've had a pretty thorough discussion, and I think we should probably wrap up. Do you have any last thoughts you'd like to share, anecdotes or recommendations?
No, just I think, I actually go out in my county to try and enhance vaccination rates, and pertussis is 11 deaths is a catastrophe, but the fear is that our population has lost their recognition of childhood illness as a serious threat. And, I'm hoping that we can learn from this, both regulatory, statutory, and even public awareness, and actually get vaccination as something that I was in the Salk, dating myself, I was in the Salk vaccine trial in Pittsburgh as a young child, and faintly remember quarantine. And I think the comment I heard at the Hart office building, this was after the anthrax attacks, is The only time they've ever seen Senate staffers stand in a line was waiting for their ciprofloxacin. I think when we get to the point where parents actively want the vaccines, we've succeeded again, and I'm waiting for that time.
It's a very, we do want parents to be eager for vaccines, but to have a deadly outbreak it's a heck of a way to design your public communication program.
Yeah.
But that's what nature does sometimes. I'm Jeffrey Fox. I've been talking with David Witt from the Kaiser Permanente Medical Center in San Rafael, California, about a recent pertussis outbreak. This ends another session of ASM Live at ICAC. We have a couple of more sessions later today.
Yeah, I just want to remind our viewing audience that the next session is at 11:15 Central Time, and it is our ICAC live streaming session from ICAC, which will feature Stuart Levy, Arturo Casadeval, and David Livermore.
Thanks, that's it.